Mixed martial arts. No one else talks about it. Except us. On the ball.
Dublin City FM.
Hello everybody and welcome to this week's edition of Mixed Martial Arts here on the ball. I'm joined on the line by Kenny Murphy. We're going to be talking MMA for about the next 20 minutes or so. We've been gone for 2 weeks, so we've a lot to cover. How are things, Ken?
Splendid. How are you, Neil?
I'm really good, thank you. Okay, so UFC 179 took place last night in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Before we get into it, Ken, 2015, are they running 7 shows in Brazil, I hear?
I believe it's something like that number. It's kind of par for the course. I think they're on course to do 5 or 6 this year.
Oh my God, it's
weird. Whenever they do these shows in Brazil, it's like you're watching totally different product. You know what I mean? Because they are so loaded with Brazilians.
Yeah.
And I have nothing against the Brazilian market. I'm sure it's great for them. But to me, I don't know. It's not like when you have a country like Ireland or a smaller country, it's kind of more of a niche product. But it's almost like with Brazil. Because it's such a big country, they're providing them so many shows, and they've taken on so many Brazilian fighters that, I mean, honestly, you had one of the fights on the main card, which I'm sure we won't discuss. We'll probably just focus on the main fights. Was a fight with Neill Dariush, and it was just like, if I told my brother, who used to be a really big MMA fan and now probably wouldn't class himself as much, that Neill Dariush was on the main card, he would just go, who? And I mean, that's probably the way with, what would you say, 85% of the Brazilian fighters in the UFC, and part of that is because it's largely to serve an English-speaking public and fan base, and it's easier to remember like Mike Pierce than it is, for example, Neill Dariush. You know what I mean?
Oh God, yeah, I know what you mean. Well, obviously, a lot of the fights are going to be, or the cards are going to be aired on Fight Pass, which I can understand from that perspective. It's very good for getting people to sign up. These specialist shows in certain areas of the world.
But it does, from everything we've heard in terms of feedback from Dana, the shows that have done best on Fight Pass have been, the Irish show, the Japanese show. I'd imagine the Australian show coming up will do good because, as I understand it, they've got a television deal in Brazil that's similar to the one they have over here, where pretty much everything is on TV. So, all they're really doing is serving, the people in Rio de Janeiro with shows like these, And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. It's just, it really does dilute the product. I mean, I don't know about you, but the days where we would make sure we watched every single fight, the Facebook fights, the prelims, and then the main card, that's gone. I mean, I don't feel the need to watch the first 4 or 5, fights on the show. I'll throw an eye, I'll see what's there, but I mean, for a show like this, I mean, I don't need to see Felipe Arantes or Fabricio Camoy's fight. I mean, I happen to watch the fights, but I'm just saying it's not really necessary. It doesn't feel important. And if I'm a casual fan, and most fans are more casual than you and I, then you're just going to skip it.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, we will skip a portion of the main card. We have a lot to talk about. So let's first touch on the semi-main event. Mr. Wonderful Phil Davis defeated Glover Teixeira by decision. 327 across the board. Phil's had a good run now in the light heavyweight division. What did you think of this fight, and what is next for Mr. Davis?
Well, I was listening to the MMA Hour, which is Ariel Helwani's MMA podcast that ironically is about 4 hours long each week, and I was listening to that on Monday, and they were running down the show, and they were talking about the bookies odds, and they mentioned that Glover Teixeira was a 3-1 favourite, and I was like, what? And I for 2 reasons. One, Phil Davis's wrestling is always going to be a problem for people, and Teixeira, granted he'd looked good in previous fights, but John Jones hadn't really tested his wrestling, but so it was a question. But you don't want to dismiss someone like a Phil Davis. But the second thing was also, I have a theory that when you see a lot of guys who work their way up to a title shot and they get there and they fail, their careers just tend to hit a downward trajectory. I'm talking about guys like, the archetypal example would be Dan Hardy, who won 4 on the spin and then lost 4 on the spin as soon as he. But you see it all the time. You see guys who get there. Like Rashad Evans, got his John Jones fight, and then he lost to John Jones, and what happened? He went and lost to Little Nog. Mm-hmm. And you see this all the time. Guys who go on these big runs, they get to the championship match, they lose the championship match, like Scott Jorgensen, who lost on this show as well. And I think that there's like a hangover. I think that it's always harder to apply yourself after you've gotten to the championship match and you're on your way back down. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I think there may be a complacency to think, okay, look, I may not have beaten the champion, but I'm better than everyone else. And so I just thought it was a bad style match and a match he was going to struggle with, and it went exactly as somebody who was going to predict Phil Davis would expect. You know, Davis just smothered him and controlled him. It was reminiscent of Chael Sonnen. Hopefully without the PEDs. You know, he just outpaced him, he outworked him, he took him down, he held him down, he tired him out, and Glover got nothing going. It wasn't a domination, but it was a blowout. You know, I don't think there was any point in the fight where you thought Glover looks like he's going to get a stoppage, and he lost his fight, and then Phil Davis called out Anderson Silva.
Well, that's a very interesting one. Anderson obviously was in attendance, you know, there in his home country. And is this something that you can see happening after Anderson and Diaz, or do you think that Phil Davis should kind of be next in line for contendership?
No, I can't see it happening just because if you're gonna, Anderson clearly wants, I think at this point, wants more fun fights than to go for a run of the championship. I know he mentioned in his most recent press conference that maybe he'd be interested in the 185 title, but of all the fights you're going to pitch to him, you're going to pitch a fight against a bigger man who is a wrestler, which is the one style that Anderson always struggled with. And it's going to be a guy who, he's a good fighter, he's a name fighter, but he's not a star. And I mean, what did Anderson gain by beating Phil Davis? The hardcores know he beat a tough fighter, but look, you know, Anthony Rumble Johnson beat Phil Davis 3 months ago, so it's just not a good fight for him, and I don't see why he would take it, you know.
The main event was the featherweight championship match between Jose Aldo and Chad Mendes. This was a rematch, and it was a hell of a match. I know we're not going to go over any of the other fights on the card, but this really stood out as the match of the night. People saying match of the year, potentially. It was extremely competitive. The judges gave it 49-46, 49-46, 49-46 across the board for Aldo. Did you enjoy this fight? And obviously, I guess the big thing coming out of it is the ramifications for Conor McGregor, who was also sitting in the front row with Anderson Silva, and what to do with him next. Does he go against Mendes after the back and forth they had recently on the what's the name of the show in the UK?
Beyond the Octagon.
Yes. Or do you do Aldo and McGregor? Do you do McGregor and someone else to move on to Aldo? So yeah, just a general breakdown of the fight and McGregor's involvement. Okay,
so the fight went 5 rounds. There was a number of stories. In terms of the fight of the year, I think last year you had all these contenders. You had the Bigfoot Silva Mark Hunt brawl, you had Gustafsson Jones, you had Diego Sanchez and Gilbert Melendez. This year we haven't really had fights of that caliber, so I think for my money this was the fight of the year. The story of the fight, early on, Chad Mendes knocked Aldo down, which surprised Aldo, and they just were really trading hard in the first, and I thought narrowly the fight, or Mendes was leading the round going to the last 30 seconds when Aldo kind of took over, and then we had a big moment of controversy when the buzzer rang and Aldo unloaded this big combo. 2 punches landed after the bell. The second which landed with Mendes's, you know, kind of arms by his side, thinking, you know, that the round is over, and it knocked Mendes down. And you know, I don't know. Do we know? Did the judges give the round based on those punches? Because you know, it was a very close round up until then, and how much damage did that do to Mendes coming into the second? Because the second round was probably the biggest blowout Aldo had. So that's a story in itself.
Now, do you think Aldo should have been docked points?
I think it should have been absolutely. I mean, I jumped up and I said, you've got to disqualify him for that, because to me, you know, it affects to me, we'll never know. But do you remember the TJ Dillashaw Henan Barrow fight from a few months ago, the one that actually happened?
Oh, the one with the stool?
Yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so at the end of the first round, Dillashaw knocked Barrow out and almost got a stoppage, and you know, Barrow's camp basically said that the rest of the fight he never really recovered, and that's why it was such a one-sided fight. Now, if we were this is Barrow's camp, you know, all those camps are the same camp. If we were to apply their logic, then Mendes may never have recovered. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. So just to clarify, Ken, for people who didn't see it, it was a punch on the bell and a punch after the bell. Is that safe to say?
The buzzer went and the first punch landed. Now, you could say maybe he was throwing it before the buzzer. You know what I mean?
That one I gave him.
Yeah, but the second one, you know, it was a right hook, and it was a big right hook, and it knocked Mendes down, and It was a huge shot. So that was that, and the rest of the fight, it was close, but Mendes he definitely won round 4, and he was on the brink of winning 5, but then the last 60 seconds, Jose really took over. So that was kind of the story of the fight. I had no problems with the decision. I did think Mark Goddard should have, if he wasn't going to disqualify him, and I can understand why he wouldn't, he should have at least docked Aldo a point, which would have made it a much closer fight going into that last round. We could have, the drama we would have had in that last round when it was, really in the balance of who was going to win it, is with that point deduction, that would have been the difference between winning and losing the fight. So, but Aldo, I have had a lot of problems with Jose Aldo because he's constantly pulling out of fights. He's always accusing his opponents of PEDs, and I'm a firm believer that if you accuse somebody of something, it's because you've got a guilty brain yourself.
Yeah.
And I just don't like the fact that he's been in the UFC for almost 4 years. This was only his 6th fight. To me, if you're going to be a champion, you have to fight more frequently than that. This is also an issue I take with Pettis, with Cain Velasquez. You know what I mean?
It's certainly with those two, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, even a GSP and Anderson Silva were doing twice a year for the majority of their long range. But there was no denying here that he was sensational, and I have to say it was a really strong fight. And then we'll move to Conor now. My overwhelming thought watching this was, don't get me wrong, every fight stands on its own, and both of these guys, they got really aggressive really early, which isn't like them.
Yeah.
And maybe that wouldn't happen with Conor, but Conor, while he has great movement, I couldn't. Watching this fight, I thought these dudes are a step ahead. I would worry for Conor against them. Now, as for what's next, let's clarify for the people. Conor McGregor has a fight booked on January 18th in Boston. It's a Sunday. It's against Dennis Seaver, who is a guy who's a low man on the totem pole compared to McGregor, whose fight is definitely on a downward trajectory. He's had a suspension for PEDs in the last year, and he's kind of been a 500 fighter for a couple of years. Wins one, loses one.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess he took that fight because he's been demanding fights. I suppose, for somebody who had nothing a couple of years ago, he really wants to be earning money when he's got the potential to. And, he's got a huge guarantee, the biggest guarantee of anybody who's never main evented pay-per-view. I think it's 78 to show and 78 to win.
This is McGregor?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. On the last show, who was in the main? Oh, yeah. The show that had Cerrone and Alvarez on it.
Yes.
His, the listed pay, you never know what people are getting in terms of bonuses, but the listed pay he had was higher than anyone else on the show, other than, I think, Demetrius Johnson got more.
Fascinating.
The champion, yeah. But, so that's, I don't really understand UFC's logic. All week long, both McGregor and Aldo had been discussing, not McGregor, both Aldo and Mendes had been discussing McGregor. McGregor was in attendance. The Swanson Edgar winner is the other option for next contender for Aldo, but I think most people would favour Edgar in that fight, and I don't really see a justification for going to another Edgar Aldo fight so soon, because the first one was not that long ago, and I want to see Frankie Edgar win some fights. All he does is get title rematches, lose them, and then wins one and gets a title match. You know what I mean?
So could you see the logic being that you just have McGregor in Boston because it's Boston?
Yeah, they want to give him another win. I guess
give him another win, and then they've been very open about the idea now that they're going to do a stadium show over here at McGregor,
Dublin, yeah.
right?
And I guess they want to wait till the summer when
exactly. So can you see Aldo just holding off until the summer now?
Yeah, but I have a real problem. No, I don't see Aldo. I think Aldo will. If Cub Swanson beats Frankie Edgar in November, I fully expect Cub Swanson to get the championship match, because I don't really see why the UFC would even think of booking McGregor again if the idea was to ice Aldo for basically 9 months. You'd be looking at, because you'd be looking at June or July, wouldn't you?
So what would you? So who'd you have McGregor go against in the stadium?
Well, no, I think you could.
You think Aldo will fight in between now and then? Yeah,
Aldo could fight in, say, February, and then fight again he could fight February, March, and then fight in August. You know what I mean? August is kind of prime weather in this country. June, July, August, isn't it really? So
yeah.
But I'm just not convinced. I very much worry that if you book a stadium show in Dublin with Jose Aldo defending against Conor McGregor, that, Aldo pulls out of every single one of his fights. You know what I mean? I can't remember the last time one of his fights was not delayed. This fight was delayed. The previous fight was delayed. He's always, and let's just call a spade. What happened with this fight was they announced blood and urine testing, and the next day Jose Aldo had an injury and had to pull out the fight. So, and Chad Mendes pointed out, you can read whatever you want into that, but my point is, I really worry that if you book that fight, Jose Aldo very rarely makes his dates. So
yeah, it's an interesting one, and I presume, especially if they go with the Aviva, that if it was to be rescheduled for, like, let's say they announced for July and it was rescheduled for the start of September or something like that, that I'm pretty sure everything would still be all right. It would go to plan.
You think they'd move the show as opposed to just change the main event?
I don't know. It's an interesting one because no matter what, it's gonna do very well, and it probably will be a case that it will do very well because the announced fight will be a championship for McGregor. But if it ends up not happening, I don't see people not going if they've already bought a ticket. So
you could always do an interim title fight, which may even work better. But the only problem is the natural, interim challenger would most likely be Chad Mendes, and even more than Aldo, I think Chad Mendes is the worst fight in that division for Conor, because I don't doubt that his wrestling defense is as good as it can be, but Chad Mendes is too good a wrestler for me to believe that he couldn't at some point take Conor down and hold him down for a while, whereas Aldo, the one thing we know is he isn't going to try and do that.
Speaking of interim title fights, Cain Velasquez had to pull out of his fight against Fabricio Verdum scheduled for UFC 180 on November 15th.
That's not like Cain, is
it? He's being replaced by Mark Hunt. So it's going to be for the interim title. First off, Cain really has. If you just looked over the last 5 years, he really hasn't fought much at all.
Here's an interesting fact sheet. Do you remember the Brock Lesnar fight, the win for Cain Velasquez against Brock Lesnar?
Of course.
Do you know when that was, Neil?
That was that like late 2010?
Yeah, it was October 2010. It was just over 4 years ago. Okay.
Flippin' hell.
Since that, Cain Velasquez has not fought anyone not named Bigfoot Silver or Junior Dos Santos.
Oh my God, it's incredible.
Yeah, he's had 5 fights in 4 years.
I remember it was late 2010 because of the Undertaker thing.
Yeah, so he's had 5 fights in 4 years, and again, I mean, there's no denying that when he fights, he's the best fighter in that division. But
well, how many more injuries can he get before it takes its toll on him?
I don't know, and I think the editor of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, Dave Meltzer, who's based out of California, knew about Cain Velasquez a long time before Cain really hit the national scene. And what he always said that Cain was an animal, he would be a world champion, but the injuries would take their toll because he overtrains. And I mean, he's had, I think it's a couple of rotator cuffs, he's blown out knees. He's just an animal, and that whole team there, aka, what's his name? Javier Mendes says that he sees the greatest heavyweight title fight in the world 3 days a week because he gets to see Cormier and Velasquez sparring. But I just wonder how much gas that's taken out of Cain Velasquez's tank. You know what I mean?
I do.
I'd still expect that whoever wins, it's going to be Fabricio Verdum against Mark Hunt, who is currently 37 pounds over the 265-pound weight limit. In Mexico City, which, by the way, if you're Mexican, that's kind of the exact scenario I spoke about with Dublin, Yes. But you'll notice they're not moving the show. They are just changing the main event, and they're not going to have a Mexican in the main event. They've got a Brazilian against an Australian. So, but anyway, I'd expect Cain still to take his licks on the winner of that fight, and I expect that to be Verdum, and I expect Cain to win that fight. But it's just a little bit disappointing, and then for the UFC, this is a year where anything that can go wrong will go wrong, and I think next year could be worse because if they're doing this new drug testing program, I think they're going to have a lot more fights that aren't going to happen.
So, what is the latest on Kung Lee and his PEDs?
So, Kung Lee's basically there were a number of, I don't want to say irregularities, but there was a number of mistakes made in the drug test itself. Number one is the type of test used is not the type of test that would be used on kind of the western side of the world. It was not the kind of test that would have been done in the States. So that was a problem in itself. Number two is that growth hormone levels are naturally higher after a fight. So that brings into question the test results, because all that was proven was that those levels were high as opposed to there was false growth hormone in the system. And number three, and this is the biggest thing of all, both the A sample and the B sample were thrown away, which means you can't even go back and test the other sample, for anything, or go back and test both samples for for false, do a carbon isotope ratio test to see if there was false growth hormone in the system. So basically, with the knowledge that there was no, the medical evidence didn't stack up, the UFC has rescinded the suspension. Kung Lee, however, is looking for them to apologise, which they have not done. And it's a real thorny one, and I wonder if it could still get legal, because certainly there's been irreparable damage done to his reputation by being accused of it.
So have they taken away his suspension, though?
They've taken away his suspension.
They have to apologise then?
I think they probably do. It's just such a hard one, because I think that, let's just be honest, he failed the eye test, 3 weeks before he failed the post-fight drug test. And, maybe he isn't even an HH, and maybe he's on something else, or maybe he's on nothing at all. I don't know. But it's just... I think that the UFC, let's not forget about it. Ultimately, when he says he's looking for the UFC to apologise, he's looking for Mark Ratner, Lorenzo Fertitta, and Dana White to apologise. And these are men who have notoriously big egos, and I think they're thinking to themselves, we know you're on PEDs. We're not stupid.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And so they don't want to do it. But it would probably be better for all if they did.
Can you see him fighting again?
No, I can't. I every time Kung fights, I've thought that's probably the end, especially the Vanderlei Silva loss.
But then
if you remember, he knocked out Rich Franklin, so that prolonged it. But this was, if you look at the shape he was in, there was no excuses for him to get so roundly destroyed by Michael Bisping, and Michael Bisping, who himself has not looked great in any year or 18 months. So I would think that's most likely all she wrote for Kung Lee.
Bobby Lashley, Donald Trump's main man, defeated Carl Edrington on Friday night at Bellator. People were saying that Edrington would be Lashley's toughest opponent to date. It was 1 minute and 31 seconds of the first round. Carl went for a takedown and just kind of fell, and Bobby Lashley killed him. Bobby's putting a run together here, Ken.
Let's...
Now, hold on. Do you think we could ever see him in UFC?
No. Oh, God, no. No, I think it's too late for that. He's 38 years old.
He is 38.
Let's just call a spade a spade. This was against a British heavyweight who has won all of his fights, and he's 9-0. But, I can't even remember the name of the British heavyweight who was in the UFC. It's Phil something or other. But, British heavyweights are less skilled than their lighter brethren anyway. But heavyweights, his first fight in the UFC, or in Bellator rather, was against a heavyweight who had a less than 500 record. He'd lost more fights in his life than he'd won. That in itself should tell you everything you need to know about kind of the standard of heavyweights. But British heavyweights just have never shown much. It was Phil DeFries is the chap I was thinking of.
Yes.
Who got a run in the UFC, and he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He had 5 fights and he lost 3 of them, and then he was let go. So, I just don't think he has the cardio. I don't think he has the skill set. I don't think he has the striking. But he can make a nice living and a nice career for himself in Bellator. So why not?
Absolutely. And finally, Ken, just because you mentioned Michael Bisping, I thought I'd ask you about his fight with Luke Rockhold coming up on November 8th. It's the next UFC event from Sydney, Australia. It's a Fight Pass show. So how do you see it going?
I feel like Bisping looked so good against Kung. And Kung came in good shape, and he did land some strikes. So I feel like it should be a close fight, but I can't help but remember how flat Bisping came in against Tim Kennedy, and my feeling then was he looked kind of like a fighter who was past his best. Against Kung, he totally didn't look that way, but it's still very hard for me to not go with Luke Rockhold here. Luke Rockhold is, he's another guy like Cain Velasquez, doesn't fight a lot because he's injured a lot and he's AKA, but when he does fight, he tends to be impressive, and he handled Tim Kennedy, and Tim Kennedy handled Michael Bisping. So using my very scientific MMA math, that means Luke Rockhold will beat Michael Bisping. But it's 5 rounds, so that's another thing.
Yep.
Stamina-wise, Bisping has the edge, but maybe we'll just get a decision for Rockhold.
Bisping for me is a fighter that I kind of would wonder if he wasn't, first of all, British, so he ticks off one demographic, and secondly, if he wasn't a good personality, I wonder where he'd be. Since the end of 2011, he's been a 500 fighter. It's been win-loss since the end of 2011. And I just can never get excited about him because I never feel that he'll have an impact in the division, you know?
Well, I think if you look at his fights, okay, he lost to Chael Sonnen on a couple of weeks' notice at the start of 2012, and I think it was pretty readily acknowledged that had he won that fight, he was going to be in line for a championship match, okay?
Yes.
Then he beat Brian Stan, and he was again kind of in the line for a championship match, because before the Sonnen fight had been on a good run. And he lost to Vitor Belfort. Now, can we put an asterisk next to that, because we know what the score is at Vitor, you know?
Okay.
Vitor was on his testosterone then, and he's not now, and we'll see how Vitor competes with Weidman, but if he doesn't, then we'll kind of know what's what with him. He lost to Tim Kennedy after all the eye problems. But, I mean, if you look at his losses, okay, we'll take the Tim Kennedy loss as red. We'll say maybe the eye problems, because he almost had to retire at one point because of his detached retina. We'll take that loss as red. The other losses are to Vitor Belfort, Chael Sonnen, Wanderlei Silva, and Dan Henderson. Dan Henderson uses testosterone replacement therapy. Wanderlei Silva has just been banned for life for running from a drug test. Chael Sonnen was on testosterone replacement therapy. Vitor Belfort was on testosterone replacement therapy. So he's very much the poster boy for what would his career have been like if he wasn't fighting guys who were on drugs. I mean, we heard Chael Sonnen on his podcast last week say that basically the reason he did drugs was that they worked very well for him. He was a better fighter because of them, and he doesn't regret it, and he's not sorry. And I mean, if you remember that fight, that was a razor-close decision. And I firmly believe that if
it was razor-close, yes.
If Chael was clean, and we're assuming Bisping was clean, if Chael had been clean, I don't think he would have won that fight.
It was short notice, too, for Bisping.
Yeah. So my point is, he's been very close. He was also very close to the decision against Wanderlei, and the knockouts against Vitor and Dan, how much of their power came from what they were putting in their body,
All right, Ken, great analysis as always. Thank you very much for your contributions today. If you want to get this episode archived on our website, you can go to thisaintfake.com. It will have today's show and all the other previous MMA on the ball shows. We also have a bumper edition of This Ain't Fake Brother, our pro wrestling podcast, coming up this week, where we discuss Monday Night Raw and tonight's Hell in a Cell pay-per-view. So make sure to go on the website if you're an MMA or pro wrestling fan. If you're both, you'll enjoy it even more. And we'll be back around the same time next week here on Dublin City FM.
On the ball.
Dublin City FM.